Okay, I have 3:30. We are going to go ahead and get started. Welcome to, and thank you very much for joining us here in the last session on the last day of the 2020 AAAS meeting. I really appreciate you joining us. This is the Death in the 21st Century, What is Left Behind session. As we begin, I do want to, on behalf of AAAS and our program, gratefully acknowledge the Duwamish people on whose ancestral lands we gather, as well as the diverse and vibrant Native communities who make their homes here today. This is a session sponsored by one of AAAS's public programs, the Dialogue on Science, Ethics, and Religion, which has as its central mission facilitating communication and engagement between scientific and religious communities. Recognizing that these often overlap. Our program's been around for about 25 years. Among the activities that we do in this role as facilitators and conveners are annual meeting symposia, such as this session here today. We had a previous one at this meeting responding to climate change, science, religion, and cultural practices. In past years, we have our presentations, sponsored sessions have included such topics as trauma and resilience, the actual practice of science engagement with faith communities, gene editing and human identity, among other topics. We also host public lectures. In particular, we have a holiday lecture every December. This last December, we hosted climate scientist Catherine Hayhoe and the former presiding bishop of the Episcopal Church, Catherine Jefferts Shorey, who is both the former presiding bishop and an oceanographer, to discuss the climate crisis. The year before that, we hosted a session on human diversity through various lenses of history, culture, and genetics. And we've, again, handled and explored a number of other topics through that sessions as well. These all are archived online, so if you're interested, if any of them catch your eye, please do check them out online at the AAAS website. Among our ongoing projects as a program include the Science for Seminaries program, in which we partner with clergy training institutions to support them in incorporating forefront science into their core curricula so that future religious leaders have more exposure to science. The project that I run on behalf of Dozer, the Engaging Scientists in the Science and Religion Dialogue, supports culturally and religiously inclusive public science engagement in partnership with AAAS's Center for Public Engagement with Science and Technology. So our activities include workshops. We had one here this morning that was very well received, and you can see some of that on Twitter if you're interested. We also have hosted events at a wide range of science society meetings and events on university campuses, all in service to this goal of fostering culturally and religiously inclusive engagement. Through that program, in fact, through both of these programs, we've produced a number of resources, video resources, print resources, and you can, again, check out all those online. They're available for download for free from our website. Some of our prior projects, in past years, we have hosted religion and culture journalists here at the AAAS meeting to learn more about forefront science and report it, and a perceptions project, which was an opportunity for scientists and faith leaders to meet and get to know each other and to discuss perceptions and preconceptions about each other, again, seeking to foster more constructive dialogue. If you're interested in learning more about the program, you can email us directly at dozer@AAAS.org. We do have a website within AAAS.org. The Science for Seminaries program has its own website, and some of the resources are archived there. You can also follow us on Twitter and Facebook, and I encourage you to do so. We do have a newsletter that goes out a couple times a year, 3 or 4 times a year, if you're interested in keeping abreast of our program activities. Okay, with that, let's turn to the reason we're all here, to learn about death in the 21st century, what is left behind. This is a really uniting part of the human experience. This is thinking about death and the fact that we will leave things behind is something that unites everyone in this room, and in fact, everyone in the world and everyone who's ever lived. But new challenges, environmental challenges, new cultural practices, new technological innovations are all going to have really profound and sometimes surprising impacts on the nature of the things we leave behind. Impacts that may affect us personally, but also our families, our societies, and the environment. And so we're really pleased to host a range of speakers as part of this session who are going to be exploring different elements of this topic, what we leave behind after death. So our first speaker is Dr. Lynn Carpenter-Boggs, who is a professor of soil science and sustainable agriculture at Washington State University Pullman. She holds a Master of Science and PhD in soil science, and her primary areas of research are biologically intensive and organic farming systems and beneficial plant-soil microbial interactions. She also works with a broad array of scientists and farmers to understand and improve the carbon footprint of farming, the nutritional quality of crops, soil health, and many other aspects of sustainability. Finally, she is a science advisor to Recompose, a company founded to offer natural organic reduction to the public as an alternative to traditional burial methods. Dr. Carpenter-Boggs.
Thank you, Rob, and thank you all for joining me. So I am here to tell you about the current options in funerary care in the US, what are their environmental impacts, and what are some of the new alternatives to those. We'll begin with looking at the current funerary practices and their impacts, and then some new ways to go. So the main reason I'm here is because I've been doing work on what's called natural organic reduction, which is the use of the composting practice for human funerary care. So I'll talk about my background in this, using composting for management of livestock, and then through the assurances process that we undertook at the university to convert this process for human use. And tell you about our pilot study, and then end with how regulation and commercialization is providing a new choice for Americans. People are becoming increasingly aware that there are impacts and burdens to our current practices. In the US, the main options are burial and cremation. There are both environmental and psychosocial impacts or burdens. Burial, of course, includes the use of cemeteries. Some of the issues there include land use, and there are areas in the US where land is in very short supply. Seattle, for instance, has restricted the creation of new cemeteries since the 1940s. In other areas, land use is not a big problem, and there still is land being purchased for expanding cemeteries. But there certainly is land use. Approximately 200 square miles in the US is used for cemeteries. There's the use of embalming fluid and potential for leaching and measured leaching of embalming chemicals, pharmaceuticals, and nutrient elements from cemeteries. In addition, there's perpetual lawn care expected on the surface of that cemetery. Caskets also carry environmental costs. The choice of materials has a big impact on how high or low that impact is. Wood, of course, is a renewable material, but the more metals are used in caskets, the higher their environmental footprint will be. Also, the cotton lining has a surprisingly high environmental footprint because of the agricultural inputs. And in some cemeteries, tomb linings are required, and others, individuals choose to have mausoleums on top, which all increase the environmental impacts. Cremation is the other primary option in the US. The main sources of environmental impacts there are from the fuel use for the combustion. There is production of particulate matter and volatile mercury from our amalgam fillings. There are good scrubbers that are available to remove those particulates and volatilized metals. The scrubbers are required in some areas and not in others. So again, the environmental impact varies with practices. In areas where cremains are very commonly spread or popularly spread, we do find areas of nutrient pollution, especially from high phosphorus from the cremains that when it's placed in waterways. Again, there are individual choices about whether or not the body is embalmed and whether a casket is used that can increase the environmental impacts. There are also psychosocial burdens, and I am not a social scientist, but I am a human who has experienced the death of loved ones, and we all have various burdens and impacts from the practices that we're able to choose from. Our current system in the US keeps the deceased from the family, although in most areas the family is actually legally allowed to keep the body at home for several days as long as it's kept chilled, so that the family can mourn in peace and come to terms with the death. The current system greatly encourages and sort of whisks away the body as quickly as possible. In various ways, we also deny decay. So both biophysically, we embalm the body to reduce the rate of decay, and we use terms like someone is resting or resting in peace. We also become attached to places and things. So for instance, keeping an urn on a mantle or even having an identified place of final placement for the body can keep the psyche attached to the physicality of a person instead of perhaps allowing a full release of the deceased. And in some areas, the funeral system has been identified as using predatory practices. So many times families are guilted into spending more than they would otherwise want to or perhaps should. So there are various reasons why new alternatives are coming online. One of those is alkaline hydrolysis. And in this process, the deceased body is placed into a metal container, a very strong alkaline solution, usually of potassium hydroxide, is sprayed on the body. Heat is applied and sometimes a bit of pressure. Over a couple of hours, the soft tissues of the body are dissolved and enter into the fluid. That fluid actually enters the municipal waste stream, and the bones are left over. Those bones are removed, crushed, and can be returned to the family just the same as cremains. And by the way, I use the term cremains because we often are calling the leftover of cremation ash, but it is actually the pulverized bones that are left over from cremation. So in doing this research, I have found that there is just not enough research about the real impacts of our funerary practices. The best studies I've actually found are from the Netherlands, where the practices are a little bit different than they are in the US. But there are some fine life cycle assessments from Elizabeth Kyer, and this is one of her recent outputs. So one way of comparing the environmental impacts of different processes is to show what's called the shadow pricing. This is an add up of the various positives and negatives of a process and trying to apply an actual monetary value to them. So you can see that in total, the burial had higher cost than cremation, and alkaline hydrolysis was a much lower environmental cost. But the contributing factors to each of those vary among the practices. And the largest contribution to the burial impact is of land use, which, as I said, in some areas is a big concern, and in some areas really isn't a concern. But other practices are coming online that have not been very well studied or compared to our current options. Green burials are more and more available across the US. Some advantages to this is that it requires much less lawn input, so the agrochemicals and mowing that are used are much reduced. The land remains multi-use and generally is still providing more ecosystem benefits like wildlife habitat. Usually there is no embalming and no casket, or sometimes there is a very simple casket used, so again, those environmental impacts are reduced. And psychosocially, some people just prefer to allow the natural course of decay and decomposition. This brings us now to natural organic reduction, which is based on very well-established practices of composting. Generally speaking, composting is decomposition, but it's fast, it's sped up, and it's hot. It's a thermophilic process. In composting, we transform organic materials biologically, chemically, and physically into a material that looks a lot like rich topsoil. This process requires organic materials that are blended in order to make a very rich feedstock for trillions of microorganisms. We monitor and manage the system so that sufficient oxygen is supplied for these microorganisms, water is kept at about 50%, and microorganisms come in the feedstocks. These conditions create the ideal environment for decomposition. There's so much activity of the microorganisms that heat is developed in the material, and there needs to be enough material and/or infrastructure around it that there's insulation and buildup of that heat. Depending on how long the composting process goes, up to half of the initial carbon in the material is also released primarily as carbon dioxide. And again, we finish with a material that looks substantially different. This is a simplified curve, of course, but in composting, again, we have a rapid ramp up of temperature in our active phase. And composting is legally defined to reach what's called a process to further reduce pathogens. In most states and through the EPA, this is defined as a minimum of 55 degrees Celsius for a minimum of 3 days. There's a large body of research showing that there's a fundamental shift in the microbial community from mesophilic organisms, which like the temperatures that we are active in, to thermophilic temperatures around 45 degrees Celsius. So meeting 55 degrees Celsius or more ensures that you're well into the thermophilic phase, and the vast majority of microorganisms that came in the material die off in that process. The other great thing about composting is that it makes compost, and there are thousands of research articles about the tremendous benefits of applying compost to soil. There are numerous improvements in soil health and plant growth and plant productivity. Compost can protect and rehabilitate soils that are damaged from erosion, nutrient mining, and overuse. It also is providing a carbon sequestration, not forever, but for a matter of decades. This material continues to very slowly decompose. So composting can be used for some specialized uses. One of those is the management of livestock mortalities, and I've been doing this work since 1998. Every livestock operation will have routine deaths, and there are not very many options of what farms can do with those bodies. Traditionally, we've had burial and rendering. Rendering used to be a free service in many areas, and there were commercial uses for those bodies, but those uses have largely been replaced by synthetics and plant materials. So now most farms have to pay up to $400 per body to dispose of a dead animal. So composting has really become much more popular and encouraged by most of the state departments of agriculture. So we have routine deaths, and there can be very large events. Right about 1 year ago, Washington State had a severe winter storm that led to the death of about 1,600 dairy cows in the Yakima, Washington area. And about half of those animals have been composted. I also want to mention it can be used for certain disease outbreaks. In 2015, over 50 million poultry were culled in the Midwest of the US to control the spread of the avian flu, and the vast majority of those bodies were composted. It kept the bodies on site to provide biosecurity, and again, that heat destroys the flu virus. So through my work in this, a graduate student and I produced a Washington State University Extension Bulletin in 2008. This is a simple how-to for farms to show them how to do livestock mortality composting on the farm. And through this work, we also did demonstrations around the state, and that started the process of our own WSU Pullman campus. We have a 4-acre composting facility, and they now routinely compost livestock, including sheep, llamas, horses, and cows. So the most simple way of doing this is a fairly passive system. You start with a bed 2 to 3 feet deep of fairly high carbon material. These are often things like wood chips, wood shavings, straw, and the body is laid on top with several feet on either side and covered with more materials. The covering material tends to be things like used feeds or moldy feeds and even manures. In the most passive types of systems, these are simply allowed to sit, heat, and very slowly cool down over the course of 6 months to a year, and composting happens. So in 2014, I got a sort of strange phone call from a graduate student in architecture school who was thinking about how we manage human bodies after death. She was aware that we have very few options, that those options have environmental and psychosocial impacts, and someone had told her that farms are now using composting to manage livestock. So she did some background research, found our extension bulletin, read up on it, and gave me a call. So it then became a larger process of thinking about what would this look like, what would it need to look like to use the basic biophysical process of composting, but to make it socially acceptable and to work well for humans. Some of the things that we went through and that we're aware that everyone will go through as they hear about this new possibility, some of it includes cognitive biases. Generally, we just, the things that we are used to, we equate with being good. We all have traditions, whether we know it or not, whether we call it a religion or cognitive traditions, family traditions, environmental attachments. We all have personal connections to material and spiritual ideas. And these ideas and responsibilities also apply to the institution. So when I proposed doing some of this work at Washington State University, there was a long process that we went through of research assurances. And it was fascinating to find out that even the human research subjects assurances that we have, they don't apply to dead people. So we went through every sort of assurance that we could find, and then we made up some more. We went through legal review, ethical review, conflict of interest, media and public relations, biosafety, facilities, air quality, security, and we did go through the human research subjects assurance, even though it wasn't legally applicable to our research subjects. So in all, we went through about a 10-month institutional review, which was a lot of work, but we learned a lot through it also. And in the end, academic freedom prevailed, and WSU supported us doing this work. So what we did, our study actually took place in a commercial rotating composting vessel. It's made of black polycarbonate. The unit we had was actually 66 feet long, so we did some modifications to create 2 research units within that that could hold several cubic meters of material. The whole round cylindrical vessel can rotate. It rolls on these rollers underneath. We can pull air through and send that air through a HEPA filter and a biofilter to remove odorous compounds. So we were using 2 of these units at a time. And we did this study with 6 human research subjects. What I'm showing here are the temperatures that we reached. So the gray line across, that's the 55 Celsius, which was our goal. We don't necessarily have to maintain that temperature all the time, but we wanted at least 1, preferably 2 or 3 periods where we were at or above that line for at least 3 days to show, again, this process to further reduce pathogens. So our studies ranged in length from 4 to 7 weeks, and we did repeatedly reach and exceed that 55 Celsius. The materials, these are some of the characteristics of the materials coming out. We got better at this as we did the 3 sets of subjects. By the last set, we were able to achieve full skeletonization and disappearance of some of the skeleton also. The final carbon to nitrogen ratio shows that the material was a rich material full of nutrients for plants, and also that it was relatively stable. That's shown by the carbon dioxide evolution. Our fecal coliforms, that was a bacterial count to show that we had destroyed the vast majority of microbes that came in the materials. I will mention that the middle set, 3 and 4, when we first took our samples, we exceeded the desired number of fecal coliforms, and we had to go through an additional heating cycle. And after that, we got these very low counts of fecal coliform. So the finished product I was extremely happy with. It looks like any other compost. Very high quality material for potential land application. I will say that because this was a research project, we agreed to incinerate all of the material from the research. Natural organic reduction and alkaline hydrolysis were legalized in May of 2019 by Governor Inslee, and the final research and development continues, to commercialize this. So in conclusion, natural organic reduction works. It provides a new choice for Americans and creates a material with environmental benefits. Thank you.
Fantastic. So we will have, left intentionally some time for questions and discussion at the end, but we'll do that after all the speakers and our respondent. Okay, so our next presenter is Dr. Fahim Hussain, who is a clinical assistant professor at the School for the Future of Innovation and Society at Arizona State University. He holds a PhD and a Master of Science degree in Engineering and Public Policy and a Master of Science degree in Telecommunications Management. His research interests include development for displaced populations, information and communication technology for sustainable development, and digital afterlife, among others. He's been involved as a technology policy specialist in various research projects of the UN, of international development agencies, and international think tanks in the fields of technology, public policy, and development. Dr. Hussain.
I did not write my bio, so I do apologize for that. It was way too long. Thank you so much, Roman. Lynn, thank you so much for your talk. Right after this meeting, I'm heading towards Nepal, and after that, I'm taking a break to go to Bangladesh to pay my last respect to my grandmother. She just recently died. So, as I'm dealing with my personal grief, these things actually kind of make me more, I don't know, sad, but at the same time, it's good to see that people are working on this. On that note, let's talk about more depressing things. Can I have, and first of all, I'm really thankful to all of you to show up in the last session of the last day. I'm kind of hoping that you are here for the talk and not because there's nowhere to sit outside. So, can I see a show of hands of how many of us have done anything to manage our data after we are dead in any of 1, 2? It's okay to do this. 2, 3, 4, 5. 5, wow. That's amazing. That's a lot. That's a lot because last time I checked, it was just 2 or 3, and I was the one. And first, when I asked it, I was not the one, and I was talking about it. So that kind of shows where we are right now. What I'm going to do, and I'm definitely sure that I will go over time, so please feel free to pull me down, not pull me up. So we are going to talk about a disconnection or a set of disconnections in design. We are going to talk about something that's so certain, but I'm not sure why we are not talking about it. So, of course, it's not an uncertainty that we are going to be dead. And if that's the case, then what on earth we are doing with our digital data? What is a digital afterlife? It's a philosophical question, I think, but there are certain lines you can see. We have digital footprints. We are doing stuff as we speak. We are live tweeting. We are having our things, intentionally, voluntarily. We are uploading online. And then we also have, we are creating resources. We have our creative things online. Things are there. We have things that we bought, our iTunes, our Kindle books, our so many other things. Then what happens to those things when we are not there? It's very interesting to see that I know what to do, or the society knows, no matter where we are, geolocation-wise, that if I'm dead, my phone, my laptop, or my anything, there is a protocol in place to process those things. But what about the content inside those machines? And that's where the problem is. I may not be comfortable that when my son grows up to see some of the things I have done in social network. So then how can I make sure that's the case? And there are emails and correspondence that I'm not sure whether my parents should see. So then what are the ways to do these things? Can we do something about it? And that's where this issues with digital afterlife comes in. So first of all, as I said, we're talking about this design flaw. And to make things even more interesting for us academics, practitioners, and very confusing for the people in general as users, is what happens globally. If we look into one of the second last one, we are talking about the new world order. We are talking about a different kind of system, governing system, not clashing, but definitely meeting each other. We are talking about geolocation-based political systems. We are talking about political identity with citizenship and whatnot. We have passports and residencies to make sure whether we are legal or illegal, we have rights or do not have rights to do something, to control our mobility. But at the same time, imagine we are talking about being a citizen of a republic of Facebook, or the nation of Google. And if that's the case, in no way I'm claiming they're doing it, just to be sure. But imagine this citizenry, this new citizenry that's coming in, and is already there. And then with that comes jurisdiction, that comes new order of people, these entities with lot of power, with lot of data of ours. And then are the users who are outside the geopolitical borders of the Western world, where most of the people are in these different services, which you will see with data, do they have the same rights? Do they have any rights? And how can they exercise those? And in many cases, they are going to be dead also. So what's up with that? It's a justice issue. It's an access issue. It's an empowerment issue. It's an agency issue. And these are some of the things that needs to be in the conversation. And of course, privacy of the deceased. We talk about the religious interpretations of things, and whether or not it's a good idea to reincarnate the deceased in augmented reality, in virtual reality. Many of you have seen that there has been a viral video of a Korean mother looking into her deceased daughter with virtual reality. So, and what would be the implications for this? Is it a therapeutic thing, or it's going to prolong our sorrow for the things, and it actually helps us or make things worse of moving on? Things like that. These are open to discussions. But more so, when we talk about users and platforms, it's very important for us to make sure that we have the conversation. We initiate the conversations. And this is just not Facebook. And this is definitely beyond Google. In many cases, if you search for digital afterlife and social media and whatnot, majority of the things comes with Facebook, because it's the biggest provider right now when it comes to social media. But this is definitely not the only provider. And that's why this is something beyond that we need to have the conversation and our focus on. But of course, let's start with Facebook, because we have data for that. So there have been many papers. One of the things published recently by Oxford Internet Institute is one of those that talks about if the growth stops, we are talking about 1.4 billion users pass away by 2100. And if the growth remains at the current rate, it will be around 4.9 billion users. So we are actually talking about, at some point, fairly recently, in the recent future, foreseeable future, we will see not only climate change, we will also see that there will be more dead people online than the living. So we are talking about, it's going to be a very interesting, depressing place to be. So in both cases, the majority of the profiles will belong to the non-Western users. So that's something for us to look into. There are provisions. We have seen that since 2010, 9, Facebook started looking into it. And then by 2015, there's a legal contract, legacy contract, where you can have people, the provisions of memorializing the dead. Google has similar things since 2013, inactive account manager. In no way these are perfect solutions. But it's good to see that at least some provisions are there. The big providers in current market, they started recognizing it. But interestingly, we'll see many of the others, and if you inquire about those things, still do not have enough provisions to deal with these dead users. And then comes the other stuff. If you talk about these provisions, is what would be the implications related with the accounts that have monetizations? What happens to the people with Instagram followers. We were talking about it, Liz, right? The YouTubers and whatnot. And can we have fake videos posted right even after they're dead? And will that earn money? If that earn money, who gets it? The fake users or the real users or the trust? And how we handle those things. So these are interesting conversation to go with. So there are laws of the lands, some. It's a good thing. I'm an optimist. I look into this and I see it's definitely an improvement in this country, at least. Out of 50, we have 46 states. Some sort of laws are there that recognizes digital afterlife and, the deceased and some footprints, the postmortem resources and whatnot. But the problem is it's far from perfect. The original draft that it had, it kind of gave the right to the deceased relatives in same way the other properties are, so that they have a say to it. But then the provision, right now whatever we have, the revised version of it, one of the things, and I'm not a law expert, but as a researcher, what I have understood from this is that by default, if we don't do anything, by default the position is all our digital resources will go and belong to the providers. It does not belong with us. We don't have anything to say about this. And also it's very complicated. There is not one single entity to manage our digital resources, right? There are so many platforms, so many ownerships. It's a diverge, it's a provider set. And then is it then our responsibility as users to actually reach out to each and everybody for this? Or there is ways, there is platforms, there is provisions for us to do this. Now imagine when we say us, what is us? Where is the actual real digital growth is growing right now? So if you look into some of the latest data, and that's the thing from last year I got, internet use in terms of the regional overviews, if you see the primary growth of the number of users, you will see that it's happening primarily in Asia, and then some parts in the Middle East, some parts in Sub-Saharan Africa. These are the ones which are growing faster than any others. So internet growth rankings in terms of the relative growth, in terms of the percentages, we are talking about countries like Djibouti, Tanzania, Niger, Afghanistan, Cote d'Ivoire, Ukraine, Cambodia. These are the countries going fast. In terms of the number of the largest absolute growth, we're looking into countries like India, China, Indonesia, Iran, Ukraine, again, Tanzania. So these are the new digital users. So when we are digitizing fast, when we are having so many, we are coming up with so many applications, so many innovations, so many startups, are we talking about also what happens to our data when we are done to these new users? I can tell you the answer. We are not talking about it. And then the question is, why? We should. That's where the problem is. There has been no guidelines, there has been no frameworks, there has been no benchmarks to follow to achieve this digital, for the digital service providers globally and even locally. All the big companies who have digital afterlife policies, they're doing it on their own. There hasn't been any kind of goals set by either the government or the policymakers, or more importantly, by any kind of citizen groups, any kind of conversation among the community to deal with our rights, to deal with our concerns related to our digital footprints hasn't been there. And in many cases, my research team, when I converse with the people in different parts of the world about digital afterlife, in many cases what we have seen that even after people are dead, those accounts are continuing, functioning by some of the relatives. That's according to many are best case scenarios. In many cases, those accounts are run by the people that the original people have no idea whatsoever. And in many cases, there are fake accounts coming in the name of the deceased as well. And the relatives of the person who is dead, they have no idea how to deal with those. And in many cases, of course, the value of these data is, the knowledge is absent. They cannot even perceive how valuable that those data can be. And as I said, these terms and conditions, what I have seen when I was teaching in Korea, many of the big companies' terms and conditions who deal with digital afterlife data and provisions, they were not translated even in the local languages. So if you do those things, if you are not transferring your provisions for your users, then how can we be sure that our data is in the safe hands? And majority of the governments are blindsided about digital afterlife. And when we do this rapid digitization, definitely there are huge issues. Because now what we are looking into, imagine the way we normalized our antivirus software thing, our stance against pirated softwares. In the same way, there has to be some sort of a normalization, some sort of a conversation going on among the governments and different entities. We haven't done that. So what can be done? What needs to be done? There are so many things. So first of all, I wish we had answers in terms of, so what should we do as users? But there are multiple levels of understanding and actions that should be done here. Raising awareness is something, even though it's vague, but it's very, very important. Imagine with all the smart people, you are coming here, including me, in AAAS conferences, and we have 5 people who are raising hands about managing our digital data. So imagine the people outside. I'm not saying that we're in an ivory tower, but I'm just saying that we are at least definitely the group of people who are concerned about science, technology, policies. So then how do we do things? And how do we localize these things in a true global sense? That's something that keeps me awake, literally, as a researcher and as a practitioner. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you very much. So our third speaker, I'm pleased to introduce Dr. Malia Fullerton. She is Professor of Bioethics and Humanities at the University of Washington School of Medicine, Adjunct Professor in the University of Washington Departments of Epidemiology, Genome Sciences, and Medicine, specifically medical genetics, as well as an affiliate investigator with the Public Health Sciences Division of the Fred Hutchinson Cancer Research Center. She received a PhD in human population genetics and completed a fellowship in ethical, legal, and social implications at the NIH National Human Genome Research Institute. Dr. Fullerton's work focuses on the ethical and social implications of genomic research and its equitable and safe translation for clinical and public health benefit. Dr. Fullerton.
Good afternoon, everyone, and I just also want to extend my thanks to all of you to still being here at this late state of the meeting, and also my thanks to the organizers. I'm really delighted to participate in this discussion and engage in some thoughtful dialogue and debate about death, this universal that we are all going to share in at some point. I had a land acknowledgement. Rob has already given us a land acknowledgement. I probably will not repeat it. I will just say, because I have had the opportunity over the course of the meeting to be as an audience member in several sessions with indigenous scientists, that just to say and to acknowledge that land acknowledgement is not enough. We start there, but it's not all. So, I have been asked to share a few remarks about the ways in which our personal genetic material may outlive us. To do this, I will begin by reminding us of the qualities of DNA which, as a robust macromolecule and a form of complex and unique information renders it persistent and significant. Then I will talk about the ways in which our genes come to be known via the process of genetic testing employed in a diverse array of contexts, and discuss what may happen to that knowledge after our demise. Finally, I will end with a few brief reflections on how, in the absence of explicit policies and procedures for the management of genetic information after our death, that we can each as individuals plan for our potential genetic immortality. So, the genetic material, DNA, or deoxyribonucleic acid, is a complex macromolecule that encodes detailed molecular instructions for the growth and development of most living organisms. DNA is both self-replicating and remarkably robust. Robust enough to be passed largely faithfully from the first cell of the fertilized zygote to all subsequent descendant cells within a developing organism, and also robust enough to be passed faithfully with some creative mutation and mixing during the process of sexual reproduction from one generation of organisms to the next. Indeed, DNA is so persistent that under the right conditions of preservation, possibly not composting, but in other forms of preservation, scientists can isolate genetic material in the form of so-called ancient DNA from the physical remains of organisms that lived tens or even hundreds of thousands of years ago, and from it derive information about the genetic characteristics of our extinct ancestors. The ability to store complex information in a highly compact and persistent form is so profound that bioengineers have begun working to develop DNA as an organic digital data storage system. Using such a system, binary information can be encoded into the strands of a synthetic DNA molecule, allowing scientists to store and increasingly now retrieve megabytes of data. Although these efforts are still at a fairly experimental stage, they are getting more and more viable and attest to the robustness and versatility of the genetic material. While DNA may not be able to survive cremation or composting, it does survive in many other contexts, and technological advances in both reading and writing genetic information are increasing the likelihood of its survival beyond the demise of the individual vessel in which it is contained. In addition to its remarkable persistence, robustness, and versatility, our DNA is, of course, also highly personal. Though human beings share 99.9% of their genetic material in common, the genome is a pretty big place, and 0.1% of that difference between individuals can encompass genetic changes at over 1 million distinct locations in the genome, called nucleotides, so that no two of us, except for identical twins, are genetically the same. That unique genetic heritage forms the basis for the use of genetic testing in various forms of identification, and is also the source of much interest from a healthcare vantage point. Importantly, however, even though the DNA of any one individual is wholly unique, we also share much of our genetic information with our family members, inheriting 1/2 of our genes from each parent, and sharing in turn 1/2 of that genetic legacy with our biological children. So even without the tangible preservation of genes in physical remains, genes persist in the forms of genetic heritage and genetic genealogy. And of course, genetic relationships extend beyond the immediate family unit to broader communities and populations of more distantly genetically related individuals. We generally cannot know the specifics of our biological inheritance from direct inspection, notwithstanding some of the more remarkable instances of familial resemblance, or, of course, more serious, usually congenital health states. Instead, our genetic information only becomes known to us in the process of the molecular decoding that has become known as genetic testing. Genetic testing involves gathering DNA from tissues, blood, or saliva, and testing either for specific known gene changes, or more often now, sequencing through dozens and sometimes thousands of genes simultaneously and generating a digital readout or genotype of the A's, T's, G's, and C's for subsequent analysis and interpretation. Such testing can take place during life, either prenatally or antenatally, or after death. During life, genetic testing can be initiated as a direct-to-consumer genetic test to learn about things such as ancestry or genealogy. in the context of a clinical encounter to diagnose or predict a future disease risk, in the research context as part of precision medicine efforts designed to seek a better understanding between the relationship of specific gene changes and disease risks, or in various forensic contexts, for example, to identify the perpetrator of a violent crime. These applications are becoming so pervasive that many, perhaps most of us, can expect to participate in genetic testing at some point in our lives. Participating in genetic testing creates both DNA and genetic information, resources which are usually retained for future use. DNA samples can be stored indefinitely and at low temperature in collections that are called typically biobanks. Genetic data can also be stored indefinitely and in digital form on standalone computers or cloud-based data storage and analysis platforms. Samples and data are stored to enable future interrogation in the context of research, clinical care, and other kinds of comparisons. Future research uses may take advantage of technological advances, such as newer ways of analyzing the genetic material. Clinical retention can be incredibly important from the point of view of revisiting prior test results in light of newer scientific information. For example, the National Heart, Lung, and Blood Institute, one of the institutes of the National Institutes of Health, has a very large research program called the Transomics for Precision Medicine, or TOPMed Consortium, which has been supporting the whole genome sequencing of nearly 150,000 research participants' DNA samples that were collected at diverse time points by many different investigators. When most of these samples were collected, it was not technically or economically feasible to do full genome sequencing, but technology has evolved. And now these samples, which are being analyzed by the latest genomics approaches, are providing valuable new data about the role of genes in heart, lung, and blood-related diseases, as well as human variation more broadly. What happens to these samples and data after our death depends largely on the context in which the genetic testing was initially conducted. Posthumous disposition of samples and data is rarely ever discussed at the time of informed consent. If permission was granted for indefinite retention and open-ended future research use, for example, under a broad consent agreement, samples and data will continue to be used, likely in perpetuity. How they will be used and whether one's private genetic information will be kept confidential will vary according to context. With direct-to-consumer genetic testing, consumer regulatory protections that govern to a degree how our genetic information is used by such companies typically expire at our death, although different companies may follow distinct policies. In the clinical context, the Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act, or HIPAA, guarantees the privacy of personal health information held by covered entities for 50 years after death. Human subjects protections, as has already been noted, associated with research oversight, expire at death. And although I could not find definitive information, it is likely that forensic genetic samples and the resultant genome profiles that are generated from such samples are retained indefinitely, including after our death. Similar to the questions raised by our digital afterlives, it is unclear whether and how consumer genetic profiles may continue to be accessed after the source of the genetic information, in other words, the direct-to-consumer genetic testing account holder, dies. One popular feature associated with the direct-to-consumer genetic testing company 23andMe is the ability to make one's genetic profile searchable by other consumers in an attempt to identify near genetic relatives. Presumably, whatever permissions were in place at the time of the decedent's demise will continue, allowing newer customers an opportunity to match, if no longer directly contact or follow up with, deceased relatives. Whether directly accessible or not, it is likely that direct-to-consumer companies will continue to make use of the genetic data of deceased consumers in much the same way that happens in publicly funded research. In recent years, and as more and more medically relevant genetic information has become available in the context of genetic testing, ethicists and legal scholars have begun to recognize the interests of family members in gaining access to their relatives' genetic information. The right of direct access to personal health information that is granted by HIPAA extends to the decedent's personal representative after death. Similarly, most research studies are willing to provide access to deceased participants' genetic data upon request, and some studies now even ask participants to whom they would want their results returned should they die before the results become available as part of the research process. 23andMe has also indicated to at least one journalist, and this was a fairly old article from about 5 years ago, that they would also release account holders' data to a personal representative or executor upon request. In all cases, results would not be shared if, prior to death, the patient, research participant, or consumer owner of the genetic information expressly forbade such sharing. Although I will note that this has not in any way been legally tested. Interestingly, while it may be legally permissible to share a deceased person's genetic information with their personal representative or executor, that may not always be the person that the genetic data holder prefers to receive their information. In one study that I participated in of research participants in a clinical translational genomics research project that was focused on examining genetic contributions to colorectal cancer risk, we asked research participants with whom they would wish to share their genetic information if they died before the results became available as part of the study. Of the 61 participants who were asked, only 42 reported having an estate executor or personal representative already designated. And of those, over 30% chose someone other than the executor to receive the results. Although this was only a very small study and may not be fully representative, it is a reminder that what a patient, participant, or consumer may want to have happen to their genetic information after death is not really possible to know with any certainty without first asking. But in practice, this question is rarely ever asked at the time of genetic testing. As noted in one recent review of international policies on sharing genetic results with relatives that was conducted by legal scholars Rebecca Branham and Susan Wolfe, only 3 other countries besides the United States, Japan, New Zealand, and the United Kingdom, have explicit policies in place to address posthumous result sharing with relatives. So, in most cases, tests are conducted and genetic information is generated without regard for posthumous disposition or sharing of such information. This is unfortunate because surviving family members may often have a compelling interest in accessing the genetic test results of a deceased relative. Consider, for example, this family from Japan in which a BRCA1 pathogenic variant, a gene variant that predisposes individuals to hereditary breast cancer, is segregating. If the female cousin in the left-hand branch of the family tree undergoes genetic testing for the family disease variant, but dies prior to receiving her test results, her children, her biological children, might be especially interested in knowing her status prior to deciding themselves whether they should undergo genetic testing and learn about their heritable risks of disease. So that's the situation with genetic testing in the living context. Although currently far less common, genetic testing can also take place after death in the context of what has become known as a molecular autopsy or in other postmortem situations. Genetic testing of samples at autopsy is recommended by the National Association of Medical Examiners in the case of sudden death, especially in younger individuals. The aim of such testing is to identify a molecular cause, for example, a mutation indicative of inherited cardiac disease, which has been found to be present in a significant fraction, in some cases up to 30% of cases of sudden death in youth. Molecular autopsy is, however, ethically complicated by public disclosure requirements in many jurisdictions, and current recommendations support notifying, if not directly obtaining consent from next of kin before such testing is conducted, although it's not legally required. There was that consent and awareness of the family. Posthumous genetic testing of retained tissue from deceased patients can also be attempted, again in the interest of identifying genetic risk factors that could be examined in living relatives. One such program, which has been proposed as a research activity by the National Cancer Institute, is called Traceback, The idea is that for women who were diagnosed with an aggressive cancer, typically ovarian cancer, and died prior to genetic testing, that posthumous testing of retained pathology specimens could be an effective method of identifying families in which a genetic predisposition is present, so that living family members might be notified about this predisposition and counseled about the advisability of undergoing genetic testing. This is still, however, a theoretical idea, and the full logistical and privacy-related concerns of employing such an approach routinely has not yet been fully investigated. But many in the medical genetics community are interested in this idea. Whether genetic testing is conducted while we are living or after we die, it is increasingly likely that our unique genetic profile will become known and continue to be accessed and used long after we are gone. Currently, few public policies or legal remedies exist to govern the responsible use or disposition of genetic samples and information after our death. And I'm sorry to say, it may be a long while before such policies are adopted and implemented. In the interim, it is therefore up to each of us as individuals to raise awareness, so again, awareness about this issue, and to begin to reflect thoughtfully on how we would like our genetic information protected and whether we would like it to be shared, either with our families for medical reasons or with our broader communities in the context of biomedical and other forms of genetic research. Not to do so is to risk that our values and interests might be compromised in ways that will make us, even after our deaths, but certainly us, our relatives, uncomfortable and or left feeling disrespected or disappointed. So that's what I had to contribute today. These reflections really benefit from many current and past research associations, too numerous, but these are the ones that are top of the list, including in my role as co-chair of the Ethical, Legal, and Social Implications, or ELSI committee of the TopMed Consortium, as well as a co-investigator with the NextMed Caesar project, which did that interesting study asking people about what their preferences were. That study led by Gail Jarvik, as well as the UW Center for Genomics and Healthcare Equality, led by Dr. Wiley Burke. I'm especially grateful to Rob O'Malley and AAAS Dozer for initiating this fascinating conversation, and I thank everyone so much for your attention.
Okay, thank you very much. So then our respondent is a alum of the Dozer program. Dr. Elizabeth Crocker, or Liz Crocker, is a program associate in the AAAS Center for Public Engagement with Science and Technology. She holds a PhD in cultural anthropology from Boston University with a focus on religion, and has conducted original research about mobile communications, social media, and representations of self through selfies, Snapchat, and Skype. She is a full moderator at reddit.com for Our Science, and was communications director for the 2017 March for Science Boston. Liz. Dr. Crocker.
Well, thank you all for being here, and thank you for such fascinating conversations today. Now, I'm an anthropologist, like Rob said, and topics like death and the meaning making around objects and places and memories are something that anthropologists are always looking into because it's universal. Many of you have said that today. It's inevitable. It's something that will always come eventually. And it's something we probably cannot stop human beings from caring about. So as policymakers, as community leaders, as scientists interested in doing new things, and as technology developers, we have to be prepared to have these conversations from the start. And when they haven't happened from the start, like with many of our social media, they need to happen as soon as we can to have these public engagement opportunities. So just a few things to think about, maybe. We have a lot of overlap, I think, between all three of these conversations. We talked a little bit about the death of the physical body, the environmental impact of that, and the real reasons why we may want to shift to something new. At some point, we also simply just run out of land, we run out of space, we're cutting down trees, we have very serious concerns here. But human beings will always find meaning in the body and in where we've placed it. We'll always find meaning in the places where we've been, and we may always want to have some place to go and reflect, some object, something that represents that person. So composting provides an interesting opportunity, perhaps, to actually create that if you can take something home that allows you to think of death as a gift, not just because it helps us remember and appreciate what it means to be alive, but because it can actually, through death, produce new life through compost. Maybe people can bring that home and not just plant a tree in someone's memory, but actually have that person fertilize that tree. That can be the place. They can pick where they want to have that placedness. But leaning into that, thinking about the fact that humans want and need this. And that place is something that's thoughtful about cyberspace too. You know, we talk about who's going to care for all these fields of the dead, who's going to care for all the graves of the digital online spaces, right? Because it's important to care for them. They may be important spaces for people to visit, to remember. These are curated spaces full of people's memories, their lives, their thoughts, their daily experiences. But if they're not cared for, there's the risk they get hacked, they get taken over, just like the graves that we care about in the dirt. So we need to have policies, we need to have plans. And as pointed out, even though death may be universal and meaning making may be universal, it's very culturally variant how we approach it. And because most of the digitization that's happening is not in America, it means the voices that are part of this conversation have to be inclusive of people in those spaces, in India, in China, in Africa. They need to be leading a lot of these conversations, which currently they're sort of left out of. And similarly, when we think about those sort of immortal lives that can happen with technology, we also think about the immortal lives of cell lines and the immortal lives of our DNA. And it's important to think about what happens, what do we want to happen, and how can we have these conversations in ways that are responsive to the very cultural differences that we have around the world related to these issues. Like, who gets to make a decision? Is it just the individual? Is it the family? Is it the community? Is it the state? And should that vary from place to place? So I think this panel in many ways is a call to action. That at least at the very, if nothing else, we need to have a conversation. So I'm gonna ask our people to come up here. We have a few minutes left, and maybe we can start that conversation today. So obviously, I encourage you to ask any questions that you have about their science, but also if you have questions about how we move forward. So we have a microphone here. Because this is such a big room, I would encourage you to please line up at the mic if you have a question. If you cannot physically get to the mic, if you want to raise your hand, someone from the Dozer team can come and get your question and bring it to the mic. Does anyone have a question that they would like to ask our panel? Great.
Hi there. My name is Will Newbegin. I'm coming from Lehigh University out on the East Coast. Not necessarily a scientific question, but more of just, I guess, a, coping one. In the past year, a good friend of my dad's from college who passed away earlier, he had a pretty active presence on Twitter, and after he passed, his brother began, using his account. His brother, with whom he didn't have a great relationship, and suddenly from a page of someone who was deceased, there came forth, racist, hateful rhetoric that my dad's friend who passed really wouldn't have, stood for. What sort of ways do you think these digital service providers and these social media corporations, how do you think they can put in mechanisms to make sure this sort of thing doesn't happen? Because I know it was a really hard thing for my dad to see, and I'm sure everyone else who was close with him.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for sharing this. This is unfortunately the only one with this kind of experience. It has been, we have seen it, documented it in many places. Specifically, I cannot comment on Twitter's dead user policies, but in general, I can give you what can be done in general. So it's first of all, two things. One is the best thing would be if the user has some sort of an idea and understanding of okay, when I'm dead, not if, when I'm dead, that's how things will follow. In most of the cases, we know that it's not happening. Then I think the protocol has to be there to notify. And this is where I think the community, the group, needs to be active. Now, the pitfall of those things are, even within the groups, if there are certain people that are, technically close in relation, say the brother, but actually they are not practically close. So then if somebody is notifying it, how valid it is. So that thing also needs to be verified. Unfortunately, there hasn't been any kind of a good algorithm or a protocol to verify one over the others, because legally speaking, so the friends do not have rights over the families when it comes to inheritance and have saying over the deceased things, and as we know that those things don't work like that, but at the same time, this kind of new challenges also opens up floors for new opportunities, where maybe in terms of the digital inheritance and other things, we define community and family in a very different ways, based on digital interactions between people. That can be one of the parameters to look into. But at this point, we don't have any provisions for that.
Was there another?
I'm Helen Haller from Rochester, New York. I have a couple of questions for the first speaker. The composting of a body, is it an entire body or is it comminuted in any way?
It is the entire body, yes.
And Washington State has legalized the alkaline hydrolysis and the composting. I'm from New York State. I don't expect you to know whether New York has, but have you any idea how many other states are there or are in the process of it or discussing it or anything?
Yeah, so currently there is legislation moving in Colorado and California. And I know that there is interest in other states. And I think the thing to do is to call your legislators and ask that they move legislation forward.
I guess knowing the bill number or the name of the law or something from Washington so that they could refer to it and use it as a model would be helpful.
Yeah, so the Washington bill was SB 5001.
Thank you.
Passed in 2019.
Hi, my name is Meredith. I'm a local freelance writer.
Can you speak up just a little bit?
Yes.
Thank you.
There we go. I'm a local freelance writer, and I have a few questions for Dr. Carpenter-Boggs. So when you discussed the environmental impact of spreading cremains, you mentioned nutrient pollution, but that didn't seem to come up with composting bodies, and I was just wondering why not?
Right, so the question was about the nutrient pollution that can occur from cremains, and why is that not considered an issue with compost. So cremains, there are regulations about where the cremains are applied, but they're not at all enforced. So this is part of the issue, is that there are certain places, national monuments, and there's a particular bay in I believe it was Hong Kong in particular, where there were many hundreds of thousands of cremains being spread in a very small area. And so especially when high phosphorus materials enter into waterways, it becomes a pollutant. So, theoretically, it could also be a problem with compost. I know that the first facility is making arrangements with a conservation area for materials to be spread that the family itself doesn't want. The nutrient density in compost is relatively lower than in cremains. It's spread throughout a much larger volume of material. And compost also is still decomposing very slowly. And so compost actually doesn't simply leach out nutrients once it's applied to soil or even water. Much of the nutrients are held within the material as it decomposes slowly.
Thank you. And I have a more vague question, I guess, is I'm just trying to imagine in my head, receiving the results of the composting of like a loved one's remains. And is this something, first of all, is this something that happens now, since it's legal in Washington?
So the regulations in Washington are not even finalized yet.
Okay.
So we're waiting for those, and the first possibility would be around May 1st, but then the facilities will have to be licensed just like any other funeral operation. The first one that I know of is going to open in about 1 year from now.
Okay. And so how many pounds of material are you given? I'm imagining the difference.
It's potentially
between
a lot.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So even there's work being done to use as small a volume of material as is reasonable, and that will still work. But if a family wanted all of the material, it could potentially be 2 cubic yards of material. And so a lot of things will depend on each facility that's offering this. There will likely be an opportunity to receive a small amount of material, a symbolic amount to bring home. The rest would be applied to a conservation area.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Maybe one more, or do you have?
Thank you all for the very interesting presentations. I also had a question about the composting, which was, I wondered if you could just share how you found your 6 subjects and maybe what made those people choose to participate in your study, basically.
Yeah, thank you. So the question is about the research subjects for the study. So I was not directly involved in identifying those donors. And part of that was for the protection of the personal information of the donors. I know very little about them. I do know that 5 of the 6 were able to actually donate themselves before their death. So they had dialogues with Miss Katrina Spade, who is running the Recompose Public Benefit Corporation. And the 6th was donated by the immediate family members. I actually did get to meet that family, and they were simply ecstatic to be part of it. So everybody really was not only donating their bodies to science, but specifically to this project. And the reasons certainly varied, but my understanding is that they were all excited to be part of something that was really new and that was environmentally potentially beneficial. And at least some of them have felt that they had a kinship with the earth and with soil, and they wanted to help to regenerate that.
I had a question for Dr. Fullerton. Something that I think I'm really interested in is the like actual monetary value of genetic information that I think is very much a part of discourse, including at sessions at this meeting with indigenous communities, with many communities of color that are so often underrepresented in these large-scale genetic samplings. I wonder if you can just talk a little bit about that element and how that might play out over these maybe very long time scales.
Right. Thank you for that question. So the question was about sort of the monetary value and the economic interests of these of biospecimens and how to think about that, particularly in the context of work with indigenous communities and other communities that are underrepresented. The issue of sort of benefit sharing in the context of genetic research and other research with biospecimens has been an issue for a long time. Legally, we tend to treat donations and research as altruistic gifts, and most people lose any economic interest in their specimen at the time of donation. And that has been the case for a long time. That has been legally reiterated multiple times in the United States context. It is, I believe, generally true around the world, although there are definitely nation states which are very, very loath to have genetic material from their citizens leave their countries, partly because they see it as an act of kind of colonialism, of biopiracy, and things like that. But exactly how to sort of, it's very clear that these samples have monetary value. There are tissue brokers that will sometimes take de-identified pathological samples and sell them on to companies that need to use them for various reasons. So it's very clear that specimens have monetary value, and yet for a variety of reasons that are sort of, to me, murky and probably arguably unfair, we don't have good mechanisms for actually compensating people for their families. And one of the examples that came up during the press conference this morning, which, Rob, I know you weren't able to be at, was, of course, the very famous case of Henrietta Lacks and the Lacks family. And it is absolutely true that the Lacks family had no monetary benefit as a consequence of their mother's immortal cell line, the HeLa cell line. And from my standpoint, as I talk to communities and to students about that issue, the larger issue was not the fact that the family did not benefit directly economically. It was this larger problem of the fact that the academic researchers who were using their mother's genetic material never came back to them and explained what they were doing, never took the time to really to thank them, never took the time to explain the value of the information scientifically and how it was really changing what we understood in stem cell research in some very, very powerful and important ways. And that is what ultimately, even though the family definitely would have loved to have had some economic benefit accrue, how they were disrespected by those longer-term uses of their mother's information. It was not the lack of economic gain, it was these larger set of ways in which the scientific community interacted with them that ultimately is what really caused ethical problems in that case. So I don't want to dismiss the economic concerns. I think they're real, but they're also a larger set of kind of dignitary issues that are also very important for indigenous communities.
Go ahead, last question.
So it occurs to me as the DNA kind of crosses over both of the other presentations in the sense of being stuff and being information. And I'm curious legally, and then maybe this is still to be determined. Is DNA treated more as the physical stuff of the body, which would be treated in terms of the composting type laws? Or is it treated more as the information, which would fit more into the sort of my future emails and the coding of my, the informational coding of my DNA? Does the law have a grasp on that right now? Is it in a third category, or is it treated more as is it more stuff or is it more information legally?
I think that's a wonderful question. I really don't know how to answer that question. I think it's both. It's literally both. Yeah. DNA, extracted DNA samples from biospecimens are a finite resource. They can be stored for a very long time, but it is not indefinite. It will eventually go away. As far as we know, the genetic information that is derived from those biospecimen goes into the cloud and is forever, right? And in terms of what we have a right to retain, what we have a right to say, I think the courts have again and again basically made clear that we have no kind of material right to the gains or anything from tissue material that is removed from our bodies. That genetic information is a larger issue that I don't think that we have. I think we all understand and want to protect that information, but we don't. I mean, I think Fahim talked about very, very nicely. It's a wild west in the digital domain, and genetics is a part of that, is one class of digital information, and we don't currently have good rules and regulations anywhere of how to deal with that information, to protect it and hold it safe. Yeah.
Sorry? Well, thank you all so much for coming today, and thank you for coming to the AAAS annual meeting. Let's have one last round of applause.